6 life sentences. No parole. No finish line. Most people think execution is the harshest punishment the system can give. But what if staying alive, aging slowly inside concrete walls, day after identical day, was actually worse? Because once the headlines faded, David Berkowitz didn't escape suffering. It stretched it, for decades. Long before prison walls ever closed in around him, instability was already shaping David Berkowitz's life. He entered the world through adoption, raised by parents who wanted him, yet carried unanswered questions about where he came from. That gap mattered more than it looked like. He belonged, but never fully felt rooted. As a child, he stood apart. Intelligent, overweight, socially awkward, and often targeted, he learned early what it meant to watch life happen from the outside. Those years didn't create violence, but they planted something quieter: resentment, isolation, and a growing sense that he didn't quite fit anywhere. Then came the moment that broke what balance he had. At 14, his adoptive mother died from cancer. She had been his emotional anchor, the one consistent presence that held him in place. When she was gone, the shift was immediate. He became angrier, more withdrawn, and increasingly untethered. Grief didn't fade, it hardened. For a while, the military filled the void. The army gave him structure, rules, clear expectations. He followed orders, learned discipline, became a skilled marksman. Inside that system, he functioned. But the moment his service ended, the containment disappeared again. Civilian life offered freedom without direction, and the instability rushed back in. Then another fracture landed. He tracked down his biological mother and learned the truth about his birth: that he was the result of an affair. Instead of answers, he found rejection reframed as biology. Whatever sense of identity he had managed to assemble collapsed. By the time he settled alone in Yonkers, there were no anchors left. No lasting relationships. No structure. Just routines tightening around a growing internal pressure that had nowhere to go. The walls weren't bars yet, but they were already closing in. And from inside that narrowing space, he started looking for something else to blame. What David Berkowitz presented to the world after his arrest wasn't just a confession. It was a story. He claimed he wasn't acting on his own will, that voices were guiding him, that a neighbor's dog was possessed and issuing commands. The details were bizarre enough to capture attention, and supernatural enough to suggest something crucial: that control had been taken from him. But the timing of that story mattered. These claims surfaced precisely when consequences became unavoidable. Madness offered an alternate framework, one where intention could blur and responsibility could soften. It didn't deny the violence. It redirected the cause. Psychiatric evaluations followed. Some doctors believed he was experiencing genuine psychological disturbance. Others noticed something different. His thoughts were organized. His memories were precise. He could track timelines, adjust details when challenged, and compartmentalize when it served him. The story sounded chaotic, but the delivery wasn't. He was observed, medicated, tested, and paused inside the system while experts tried to decide what was real and what was constructed. Over time, the narrative began to lose traction. The behavior didn't match a mind overtaken by uncontrollable delusion. It matched a man choosing when to appear unstable and when to appear coherent. Years later, that illusion collapsed completely. Berkowitz admitted the possession story had been exaggerated and, in key places, invented. The voices weren't external. The commands weren't mystical. He knew exactly what he was doing. That admission didn't make him safer. It made him more unsettling. Madness suggests loss of control. Fabrication suggests choice. And choice reframes every act that followed, not as a break from reality, but as a deliberate crossing of lines. The story that once protected him was gone. And what remained wasn't confusion. It was intent. And intent doesn't appear all at once, it gets tested. The first act of violence didn't announce itself as the beginning of anything. There were no headlines, no citywide panic, no name attached to it. In late December of the mid-1970s, David Berkowitz attacked a teenage girl with a knife. She survived. The injuries were serious, but the outcome mattered more than the damage. She lived. And because she lived, the world kept moving. No immediate arrest followed. No public warning. No sense that something dangerous had just been unleashed. For Berkowitz, that absence was the lesson. He had crossed from fantasy into action, and nothing stopped him. That moment changed the equation. Violence had been imagined before, rationalized, rehearsed in his mind. But now it had been tested. He approached. He struck. He walked away. The fear was real, but so was the silence that followed. Survival didn't shut the door. It opened it. He returned to his routines unchanged. The city didn't know his name. The victim didn't know who he was. There was no confrontation, no reckoning, just the knowledge that he could act and remain invisible. This is where escalation begins. Not with obsession, but with confirmation. He learned that anonymity protected him. That proximity could be brief. That a sudden strike could be over before anyone processed what they had seen. Restraint no longer satisfied anything. The line he had crossed didn't hold him back, it became the starting point. Thought and action moved closer together, faster than before. And that's when he adjusted. Not his motive, his method, because what came next wasn't about expression anymore. It was about certainty. And once certainty entered the picture, survival stopped being negotiable. Once the gun entered his world, everything changed. Distance replaced contact. Control replaced hesitation. And the violence stopped being personal. New York City itself became the target. The attacks didn't follow a pattern anyone could learn. Different neighborhoods, different times, different people with nothing in common except being in the wrong place for a few seconds. Parked cars, sidewalks, front stoops, ordinary spaces that had always felt safe. That randomness was the point. Without a pattern, there was nothing to avoid. Couples stopped sitting in cars. Nightlife thinned. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone, not to linger, not to trust familiar streets. Fear didn't live in one area. It moved. Each attack reset the city's nerves. Survivors described sudden noise, sudden pain, and then absence. Others never spoke again. What mattered wasn't the numbers. It was the uncertainty. No one knew where he would appear next, or why one person was spared while another wasn't. Law enforcement shifted from understanding motive to stopping momentum. The NYPD pulled hundreds of detectives into a massive task force. The goal wasn't psychology anymore. It was containment. Ballistics became the only constant. Spent shell casings, grooves etched into metal, silent proof that the same weapon was moving across the city, linking scenes that otherwise made no sense. Science replaced instinct. Data replaced guesses. But fear still moved faster. Days would pass, then weeks, just long enough for people to believe it might be over. And then it would happen again. Each gap stretched the tension tighter. By the final attacks, the city wasn't asking who he was. It was asking when. Fear had become ambient, like weather, unavoidable, shared, and always waiting. But anonymity wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to be seen. The violence had already terrified the city. But the moment he decided to speak, everything escalated. Letters began arriving, taunting, theatrical, deliberate. Until then, the fear had been faceless, a presence without a voice. Now it had a narrator. He mocked police, teased the press, and framed the entire city as his audience. And then he did something irreversible. He gave himself a name. Son of Sam. It was a calculated move. Names travel faster than descriptions. They turn panic into story. The attacks were no longer isolated crimes, they were chapters, linked by a signature that could be repeated, printed, remembered. The damage multiplied. Publication carried his words farther than any bullet ever could. Fear became performative. Women changed their appearance. Bars emptied. Couples avoided parked cars entirely. He didn't need to strike to stay present anymore. His name alone did the work. But notoriety comes with a cost. Once a killer insists on being seen, anonymity starts to crack. Tips flooded in. Sightings multiplied. The mythology distorted reality, turning strangers into suspects and paranoia into routine. But that same attention began narrowing the field. Patterns emerged. Focus sharpened. Infamy had protected him by spreading panic. Now it was doing something else. It was exposing him, because the moment he stepped out of the shadows and demanded recognition, he sealed something permanent. There would never be a future version of him without that name attached. And the audience he craved was about to stop watching, and start closing in. The hunt didn't end with a chase. It ended with a detail that refused to disappear. On the night of the final attack, a witness noticed something that didn't fit. A man near a car who seemed out of place. Not running, not hiding, just there, at the wrong moment. She reported what she saw, including a vehicle that stood out in the area. That observation entered a system already stretched to its limit. Investigators began tracing parking violations issued near the crime scene that night. Among them was a ticket tied to a cream-colored Ford registered in Yonkers. The name on the registration was David Berkowitz. From that point on, everything accelerated. Surveillance teams moved in. His apartment became a fixed point. Movements were tracked. Routines documented. The mythology no longer mattered. Procedure did. When officers approached his car days later, the evidence was already waiting. Inside were maps marked with previous crime scenes. A duffel bag, weapons, letters, some already sent, others prepared and ready. The chaos that had terrorized an entire city collapsed into a single, undeniable line. There was no resistance, no confusion about why he was being stopped. He knew it was over. What followed was immediate and thorough. He confessed in detail. The planning, the randomness, the movement across the city. The hunt that had consumed New York for over a year ended not with spectacle, but with clarity. The city exhaled. Streets filled again. Routines slowly returned. But for Berkowitz, this moment wasn't punishment. It was relocation. Because capture doesn't decide suffering. It only decides where it begins. When sentencing arrived, there was no ambiguity. 6 consecutive life sentences. Not symbolic. Not theoretical. Structured to stretch beyond any realistic lifespan. There was no finish line built into the math. Parole existed on paper, not in reality. The judge didn't need to say where David Berkowitz would die. The sentence already did. Prison didn't dilute his notoriety. It concentrated it. He entered maximum security as a name before he entered as a body. Guards recognized it. Inmates recognized it. The violence he had once inflicted anonymously finally had a direction to travel back in. Less than a year into his incarceration, it happened. While moving through a recreation area, another inmate attacked him with a razor blade. His throat was cut. He survived, but barely. Dozens of stitches closed the wound, leaving a scar that never faded. There was no symbolism, no closure, just consequence. The attacker later claimed he was acting on divine instruction, echoing the same language Berkowitz had once used himself. The irony was immediate. The message was permanent. For the first time, he experienced what it felt like to lose control without warning. Sudden violence. No defense. No preparation. The vulnerability he had imposed on strangers finally reached him. Survival didn't reset anything. It changed the terms. From that point forward, safety was never assumed. Transfers followed. Monitoring increased. His presence became a permanent risk factor, not because of who he was now, but because of who he had been. Infamy didn't protect him inside prison. It hunted him. And once the immediate danger faded, something slower and far more unforgiving took over. Time. Years later, David Berkowitz was transferred to a different facility. Not as progress, as duration. By then, the danger had become predictable. What replaced it was repetition. There were no milestones left to anticipate. No hearings that promised change. No countdowns. Just the same mornings, the same routines, repeating without direction. He worked prison jobs, attended services, read, wrote letters, spoke when required, stayed quiet when it was safer. The days didn't build toward anything. They stacked. Time became the punishment. Seasons changed outside the walls, but inside, light and routine stayed fixed. His body aged. Strength faded. Movements slowed. The cell didn't change size as he did. The calendar mattered less than the repetition itself. Religion filled some of the space. He claimed to have found faith, leaned into it fully, and reshaped how he spoke about himself. Supporters pointed to consistency. Decades of the same behavior. No interviews. No attempts to profit. No public performances. Critics saw something else. a narrative layered over permanent damage, belief coexisting with manipulation. The system didn't take sides. His sentence didn't shorten. Parole didn't soften. Faith changed nothing structural. Parole hearings arrived on schedule and left on schedule. Each one followed the same path. The record was reviewed. The scale of fear was restated. The damage was reaffirmed. Release was denied. Sometimes he didn't even argue for freedom. He said staying locked away was appropriate. That release would reopen wounds that never healed. Eligible didn't mean viable. Heard didn't mean reconsidered. Years passed. Another hearing came. The outcome never changed. Parole became a reminder, not a possibility. A ritual designed to restate permanence. By then, more of his memories existed inside prison than outside it. The world he once moved through no longer existed in any recognizable form. New generations learned his name secondhand, without ever having lived the fear. His body weakened. His reputation didn't. That's the final shape of a life sentence. Not spectacle, not intensity, just continued existence inside a structure that never asks anything new of you, because it doesn't need to. And when nothing dramatic is left to happen, the sentence reveals its true design. It doesn't end suffering, it preserves it. From the beginning, this story was never really about guilt. That part was settled decades ago. It's about consequence, and what happens when punishment doesn't arrive all at once, but stretches across a lifetime instead. Execution offers finality, a single moment where fear, awareness, and anticipation collapse into silence. Whatever suffering exists before that moment has an end. A life sentence does something else. It removes the ending entirely. Every morning extends the punishment by one more day. Every year deepens the separation between the person inside the cell and the world that continues without them. There is no peak, no release, no final chapter, just persistence. Outrage fades. Headlines disappear. Generations move on. The sentence doesn't. Aging happens inside walls that never soften. Parole hearings arrive only to reaffirm permanence. Memory refreshes itself through retellings, ensuring the name never disappears even as the body weakens. Some argue death is the harshest penalty a system can impose. Others argue that death ends accountability, while life imprisonment enforces it continuously, without escape. This story doesn't answer that debate. It shows what permanence actually looks like. Not spectacle, not drama, just time doing its work, one day at a time, until consequence becomes indistinguishable from existence itself. And that leaves a final question, heavier than any sentence.